Welcome to the last plenary session of our PhD student symposium. If you've made it this far, congratulations and thank you. I think we've had some really nice discussions, both in the plenary sessions and the special tracks and the student paper presentations. And for this last panel, I have with me three former SEC chief economists, well-known academics in the profession. And we're going to talk about the connection between academic research and policy. I think it's a very important link. The whole purpose of this event and conference is to help generate ideas for emerging researchers and scholars to write about. And one of the best places to look are active policy debates. Generally, they focus on market failures, frictions, disagreements on how things should run and operate. And that's a perfect opportunity for somebody to study and do research. With me is Larry Harris. He's a professor at the USC Marshall School of Business. He was a chief economist that predated my time at the SEC. We also have Chester Spatt. He's at the Tepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University. For better or worse, he was responsible for hiring me as an economist at the SEC and then promptly left. And that gave me to Craig Lewis at the Owen School of Management, Vanderbilty University. I was a chief economist that I worked for 2 or 3 years. And between the three of them, I've been impressed with how they think about issues, and I'm very much looking forward to what they have to say today. We're doing 75 minutes. We have a number of topics picked out that we're going to talk about. I'm going to pepper them with some questions, but we also want to hear from you. So use the chat, use the Q&A, however you want to do it. I'll be monitoring that. If you have a question for them, I will weave it in, time permitting. And so with that, let's start. We'll go in order of Larry, Chester, and Harris, and Craig. If you can just start with a few minutes about how you think about policy, its connection to research, and anything you have to say about current market events that you want to preview for some of our discussion would be great. So Larry, do you want to lead off?
Thank you, Scott. Academic research in finance has an effect upon public policy several different ways. The two most important ones are, first of all, academics occasionally are able to identify issues that regulators are unaware of. And by bringing them to the attention of regulators, regulators can then correct problems that people may not have been aware of, or which simply didn't rise to the regulator's attention. This is very important. Doesn't happen as often as it should, or as we'd like, but it is a very important process. And there have been several very important studies that have done this. I think in particular, like the odd eighth study in NASDAQ, that would be an excellent example of basically slamming regulators' attention to an issue that needed attention. People are aware of it, but didn't really fully appreciate it. The second role is that academic studies help regulators address issues that they know the right answer to, but where they have trouble getting to where they need to be because of vested interests. So a good example of this would be a study that I did when I was at the SEC with Mike Pivovar and forgive me for
Amy Edwards.
Amy Edwards, thank you so much. Save me some embarrassment. So this was on trace data. Trace data was being collected, but was not being widely disseminated. And as academics, we had a very clear understanding of the benefit of disseminating the data. And I think everybody recognized what the benefits were, including the dealers who didn't want to see it disseminated. So there was a lot of pressure from dealers not to disseminate it. And by producing an academic study that documented the dollar value of the benefits that would result from disseminating the data, it gave the commissioners a platform upon which to stand, some strength to do what I think everybody really understood needed to be done. Um, in all cases, whether it's to identify an issue that is not well known yet, or whether it is to provide support to regulators so that they can get through the resistance of vested interest. What's most important in an academic study, aside from obviously has to be correct and unimpeachable, what's most important is that it can be summarized into one stylized fact or a couple stylized facts that become a focal point for debate. Regulators are very sharp, but they face a tremendous number of issues, and things need to be made simple. But more importantly, where regulators may understand things, the public has even less of an attention span and of course, much less background. And so being able to quantify something in a stylized fact that can be picked up by the press is really important. And so if you want to have significant impact in research on public policy, it's very important to make sure that the message can be delivered in really one sentence and summarized perhaps by one really important and easy to understand number.
Yeah, Larry, that was wonderful. And I just wanted to reiterate what you said about the one-line description of your conclusion. A good abstract takes a paper a very long way in the eyes of a regulator when they're kind of searching for research that might be relevant. Kumar Venkataraman was on another panel, and he served on the Fixed Income Advisory Committee. And I'll let you know, Larry, that this past year on that committee, dealers were still pushing for opacity in the fixed income market. And as an academic, one of two academics in the panel, he had to push back vociferously on that notion that would be good for markets. So some ideas never really go away from market participants.
Larry,
Scott, you may be amused to note that
Larry was the other academic on the panel.
There we go. So great, Chester.
um,
Oh, you were there too, Larry. Is that right?
yes. And it was quite an experience. We could talk about it later, but that was an extraordinarily interesting experience in terms of understanding political economy. We should talk more about political economy, but I don't want to. We should move on to Chester and to Craig.
Go ahead, Chester.
Okay, so what I would stress. So I served as chief economist from 2004 to 2007, which I guess sort of looking back was a quiet period at the SEC, although I didn't realize it at the time. It was a quiet period in the sense that it was after Sarbanes-Oxley, and most of the Sarbanes-Oxley rules had been done, and it was certainly before the financial crisis. So in a sense, it was sort of the in between period. But there were many issues on our agenda at the time that involved substantial economics, issues involving credit rating agencies, issues involving mutual fund market timing and valuation, valuation issues in the option space, especially option backdating, many issues involving short sales, the pilot study and repeal of uptick restrictions on short sales, issues involving delivery kind of requirements. In fact, some of these issues and regulation, and of course, regulation NMS. And of course, many of these issues, not all of them, but many of them are still the issues of today. The issues, they evolve over time, but they don't necessarily completely disappear. What I would emphasize is the importance of research in the regulatory process, both from the point of view of empirics and from the point of view of theory. Theory provides a way to think through issues and to frame issues, and empirics provide an understanding of context and facts. And both of these, I think, are extremely important to the regulatory process. Now, they're not the only inputs to the regulatory process. There's obviously important inputs from the practitioner community. that obviously bring a lot of institutional knowledge. They also, from time to time, bring a bunch of self-interest as well. Some of Larry's comments certainly alluded to that. But they also bring a lot of institutional sophistication, and there's also political considerations, and you see some of the political considerations with the ebb and flow of different issues on the commission's agenda. But I would emphasize, from the perspective of our audience today, the importance of economics. Economics, I think, both helps, as Larry emphasized, helps define some of the key issues, helps identify issues, and provides a way to think through these issues and to provide facts. And I think in many cases has had substantial influence on the way the commission ultimately comes out. Now, obviously, in many cases, there's certainly sharp debate, but I think economics is very important. And I think its importance particularly is illustrated by the support for the indirect support for economics that has emerged through the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals, which is made clear in a number of court rulings, starting in 2005 when I was chief economist, and then maybe more strongly later on, about the importance of cost-benefit analysis. And Craig, in fact, has had a very important leadership role in then changing the commission's approach and taking cost-benefit analysis more seriously. I must say, during my period, I didn't quite understand the full import of cost-benefit analysis. I thought it was some chapter in the back of a public finance textbook. But I learned it was really what I've learned over time is the opportunity to bring the full power of economics into the rulemaking process. As I look forward, I think there's a number of issues where economics continues to be very important and very powerful. Certainly, a lot of the issues in market structure, there are continuing forms of these issues as a byproduct of NMS, having to do with different kind of conflicts in the routing process and the like. Different issues involving governance, which to some extent, some of the current debates about ESG and climate and the like, I think will perhaps further highlight. And issues indeed, partially as a byproduct of GameStop, but not only, issues still involving short sales, which are, I think, are a fundamental aspect of our markets. And I hope to comment on a couple of these themes later.
Great. Thanks, Chester. And Craig, before you start speaking, I'm going to embarrass you by saying that you're the chief economist responsible for issuing the guidance on economic analysis that came after the SEC was 0 for 8 in the courts on defending its rulemakings, 4 of them having lost on the grounds of economic analysis. And so I think that was a major shift that Chester alluded to in recognizing how important that prong was. And I think at one point in time, somebody called you the 6th commissioner because you had the veto right on any rulemaking by saying it didn't adhere to the economic guidance. And I don't know if people still view chief economists in that way, but with that, Craig, have at it. And you're muted.
I'm muted because the building is under construction. You may hear hammering and pounding in the background as I speak today. But thanks for that introduction. Yes, one of the benefits of getting to go last is that Larry and Chester opened so many doors that I could possibly explore as I go through my comments. And I've almost completely rejected what I'd originally planned to say. And I'm just going to go with something completely different. I particularly liked Larry's idea about political economy and how politics plays such an important role in developing policy, and how economics has the ability to try and create a more objective way of viewing rules. And I think that was, if anything came out of the guidance that we released while I was there on how to conduct economic analysis, it was really setting that level playing field and empowering, really, internally the economists, largely with the ability, the requirement that the chief economist has to concur to the economic analysis. It is virtually like a certification that a CEO would have to provide for a 10K. That creates a lot of power if you're willing to wield it internally, right? The threat of not agreeing with the economic analysis is almost enough probably to derail a rule at the very start. But I thought I would, because this has become a hot issue today, and we're going to talk a little bit about it later, I hope. And I'm going to give you an example of political economy issues that revolved around money market funds while I was at the commission, and how economic analysis and really some economic thought dramatically changed the approach that the SEC ultimately adopted. While I was there, both the Fed and the Treasury were placing significant pressure on the SEC to adopt a particular reform option, which was the requiring money market funds to hold capital buffers to indemnify shareholders, essentially against losses that might occur in prime money market funds. And at the time, it definitely looked to me, and this was right before I became chief economist, it looked to me as if that was going to be the recommended policy choice by the commission, was to employ capital buffers. And so one of the things that I did was I created an economic model to really demonstrate what a capital buffer was really all about. And it was really this ability, and we'll talk about it later, but it was this ability, effectively what a capital buffer did was convert a prime fund into a government fund, and in some sense destroyed the utility of what a prime fund had to offer. And I do think that armed with that analysis and a significant amount of empirical work on what actually happened to money market funds in the crisis, the commission was willing to step up and say, we're not going to go down the capital buffer route. We're going to pursue something that's much more in the wheelhouse of the SEC, which was a floating NAV option, right? And so I think that there was a really clear example of how economic analysis fundamentally informed the commission and got them to change the approach that they planned to take. And so as we have these comments, I think that a lot of what we've talked about is all on the policy side. But if you think about the SEC's primary mandate, which is investor protection, policy is designed to protect investors, but there's also enforcement of those rules and regulations that the SEC adopts. And I think that was one of the reasons why I actually was initially interested in really becoming chief economist, was the opportunity to help more on the enforcement side and think about how you could bring in data and empirical modeling, sort of econometric analysis into enforcement. And so with this topic, so you initially asked us to comment a little bit about how this has informed research. I found the idea of trying to think of ways to effectively look at accounting fraud, for lack of a better term, at the commission, and how could we sort of have a modeling approach to that. Scott, you helped a lot on that initiative while you were deputy director in DERA. And one of the research takeaways I came with was the potential role and benefit that text analytics has in the way the commission conducts its research. And so I really knew nothing about textual analysis while I was chief economist before I went into the job, but started to work on a project with Jerry Hoberg, who's now at USC, about, on text analysis and trying to predict fraud, and using the text in MD&A discussions to see if it had any indicia of firms that were committing fraud. And so I've done a lot of my post-SEC research on text analysis, how you can use text analysis to better understand communications between investors and firms. And so, and that's gone more on the direct theoretical side of text analysis as well as empirical work as well. So I think that is one of the ways in which I think sort of economics and research go hand in hand. I thought I learned a lot while I was at the commission, but I think that was one of the areas that really kind of interested me, and I would never have anticipated that becoming a primary research path for me prior to that. So I will end there and turn it back to you.
So Craig, I just put a paper that just published in the JAR on the role of economic analysis and policy at the SEC by Rachel Jeffrey and Heman Lee. You may not know, but you're responsible for that by implementing the policy that they studied. So a good example of an accounting journal publishing a paper on the impact of research. I'd want to talk about money market funds, and you already touched on it, but let me make one comment too about a stylized fact or using text analytics. I recall you pushed for that early on, and the SEC was using text analytics and fraud misconduct detection. I always thought it puzzling that journal referees were so afraid to use it in research, couldn't understand it, and how the industry and its use was really way ahead of it. And I think that's now changing. So it's very interesting to see it being more widely accepted in research and by referees. But let's go back to political economy, because we already have our first question. And I think it's interesting because David Park asks what your thoughts are about specialized disclosures. And Craig, this is during your time or during your tenure on Dodd-Frank Act, conflict minerals, disclosure rule, mine safety, and what is the role of accounting and finance research to inform on those types of policy, noting that this is a social agenda, which has a different flavor than many market failures that the SEC might otherwise address. But let's go ahead and go back to political economy, use it as a catalyst. And if you could all just share your views, maybe we'll start with you, Larry, again, too, on these and related issues.
Well, it's clearly a political issue. It's a social issue. The SEC should not be engaged in choosing which of these issues they want to pursue. It's outside of their expertise. The mineral disclosure was mandated by Congress, and Congress thought that this was perhaps the best way to do it. The public policy issues that may concern us about this are how expensive are these disclosure requirements? At some point, it just becomes more and more expensive to be a public firm because you have to abide by so many different rules. And this is just another one of them. You think it's a small one, but if they just keep proliferating, it becomes bigger and bigger. There's also an issue of how distracting are these disclosures to investors who need to be focused on issues that are of greater immediate importance to them. There are questions about, can you argue that the disclosure is solving some market problem that people don't fully recognize how a company's reliance or exposure to a particular social issue or something like that they don't recognize how that exposure will affect the value of their investment in the future. That's a huge statement to suggest that somehow the government could see this better than other people, but there might be some arguments along that way. But overall, I think the SEC's role should be to focus on disclosures that they have to do with cash flows and risks that shareholders and other investors would be exposed to. I would note that the Financial Economists Roundtable, a group that I have served recently and been a member for a long time, just addressed this very issue lately and came to the conclusion that I just shared, that these disclosures are best limited to disclosures that are important for valuing securities, and leave it to the government or other entities to try to conduct social policy differently. That's not to say that any of us shouldn't have our own views on social policy, but probably the best way to express that is not by, at least in my opinion, pushing corporations to do these types of disclosures.
Chester or Craig, do you want to add on to that?
Well, I'll just say that when I mean, I agree with the thrust of Larry's comments, certainly. I would just add that when you ask a regulator to do things that are outside its primary expertise and outside its mission, part of what you wind up with is the regulator to some extent that's distracted from its mission, and from what is very important to our society, namely good disclosures in the financial space. And what could be more fundamental to our society in the allocation of resources than the intertemporal allocation of resources? And I think when these disclosures are layered on, we weaken the ability of the regulatory agency to focus on its core mission.
So I'll chime in here. I actually share very similar sentiments to Larry's perspective. And one of the ways to possibly frame this is to recognize that when the SEC was formed, it was designed to be an independent agency that was allowed to determine policy and make policy decisions based on its expertise. But over time, Congress has basically taken over that function, the SEC, by passing the Dodd-Frank Act, the Jobs Act, Sarbanes-Oxley, and effectively dictating to the SEC what its policy agenda is. And because it's a political body that's passing these acts, it means that the SEC is frequently confronted with addressing political issues. And conflict minerals is an example, pay ratio was an example, right? Resource extraction was an example. And you'll remember, Scott, because we were both there working on those rules, effectively, as an economist, what we did was we basically threw our hands in the air and said, we're not sure what the benefits are from these rules, but we're pretty certain Congress had some idea. So we're going to defer to the wisdom of Congress and say whatever benefits Congress intended, they're there. Now let's focus on what we can, which is to talk about how expensive these rules actually are to implement. And so we had, in both of those cases, we had economic analyses that effectively came down and said, the costs outweigh the benefits, but we're going to pass it anyway because this is what Congress has mandated, and the SEC is responsible for honoring that mandate. So to me, that is one of the key issues. And so how does the agency get back its ability to function as an independent regulator and focus on rulemaking that actually is designed to protect investors?
It's useful to note that this example is an example of a larger trend that we're seeing throughout government. When the government can't do what you normally expect the government to do, they try to figure out ways of getting other people to do it for them. So minimum wage is an example of that. As economists, we all recognize that minimum wage is a tax with an immediate benefit given to the wage holder, the salary, the people earning wages. The government doesn't want to raise the tax and doesn't want to distribute the welfare, so they impose a minimum wage. This is true for all mandates. This is just an example of another mandate. It's easier to do a mandate than to actually do the business of government when the government's really divided.
Think of it as backdoor regulation, right?
Yeah.
The idea is that Congress knows it can't pass the rule itself, so it delegates to the SEC. But the SEC isn't immune from backdoor regulation either, because it has been known to take rules it would like to pass but can't, and essentially ask FINRA to do its bidding for it. So backdoor regulation takes place all the way down the food chain.
All right, another example, this is NASDAQ's recent rule requiring diversity on the board. So that's just another social issue, for better or worse. And of course, the way it is it doesn't require the diversity. It says if you don't have a diverse board, at least 2 members who are from named populations, then you just have to explain to us why you don't. So that's like the most benign regulation, but it's still more regulation, and it's burdensome.
Yeah, so this, taking it back to what the role of an economist is, and all of you have this experience, whether it's a mandatory rule given to the SEC by Congress or discretionary where the SEC uses its own discretion to pass a new rule. The role of an economist has historically been to inform a politically appointed commission of 5 commissioners, Democrats and Republicans, and explaining the trade-off. So everything you just said right now is, would that be reflective of a conversation you would have with a commissioner when they're trying to figure out how to vote on a particular matter? Did you want to describe how economics are used to inform the commissioners who vote on the issues?
I've spoken a lot, but I'm happy to talk about it. Let somebody else go first.
So maybe I'll jump in real quick. I'll just explain my experience while I was at the commission. And I had regular meetings set up with all the commissioners. And I had the view while I was chief economist that being despite whatever personal political philosophies I held, that was not my job, and I was not there to push an agenda that was political. I needed to be an objective and an analyst of what I thought the economics were, and so I felt that if I wanted to really have influence at the commission, that was how I needed to be perceived by the commissioners. So when I went into Luis Aguilar's office, who was the Democratic commissioner at the time, I wanted him to know that I was there to give him my unbiased feedback. And if I went into Troy Paredes' office, who was a Republican commissioner, who I probably was more aligned with from a political perspective, but I wasn't overt about it. I wanted him to know that I was going to tell him what I thought the upsides and the downsides of certain decisions were. And so I would typically come in with some type of prepared analysis, sometimes to show them that I was working on. And in one case, I was dealing with who had to register as a swap dealer and what the thresholds were going to be. And I had been working on some of this the CDS transactions data. And I really went into Troy's office one day and said, hey, look, it appears that there's a very small subset of swap dealers who transact about 90% of all the volume in those markets. And so what ended up happening was Troy just saw that, and he saw something I didn't, which is we could use this to establish thresholds on who had to be a swap dealer and who didn't. And it ultimately turned out that that was how that rule was actually finally finalized, was based on some of that analysis, right? And so there's an example of how your meetings with commissioners can sometimes have unintended benefits for you.
That also highlights the power of stylized facts. We don't always appreciate it in publishing articles, but to a trained eye, you look at stylized facts, that helps inform decisions.
Yeah. So I have a similar story. When at some point as NMS was being reproposed. It had initially been proposed when Larry was chief economist, and it was reproposed when I was at the commission. And when it was reproposed, the structure of the rule was that the order protection would be at only on the order at the top of the book of the individual market makers, but not necessarily the best prices across, because there might be a gap, because one market maker's best price might be 2010 and another market maker's best price might be 20, but the prices in between wouldn't necessarily have protection, because the protection would just be at the single top across the book. So of the individual market makers. So I pointed out to the chairman and the lead staff member that some of the inconsistencies associated with this. So as a result of that, the commission rolled out actually an alternative. The alternative was to provide order protection all the way down. Well, the import of that probably sealed the deal for the original proposal. And the reason was because the industry was so aghast at the possibility of needing to provide order protection all the way down, and the logistics associated with that electronically in that era. And indeed, I think the outside media viewed this was some kind of strategic attempt by the commission to force things. But basically, I was just making some observations based upon the economic structure of what was being proposed.
I'd like to make some observations about how the commissioners differ politically. Ignoring social issues, which will be increasingly difficult to do in the coming years because they seem to be coming up in front of the commission a lot. But ignoring that, the commissioners split on basically two dimensions. One dimension is a taste for regulation or not, with the Republicans being very opposed to regulation. And most of the Democrats opposed to regulation as well, but recognizing that it might be necessary to promote competition and fairness. So that's one dimension. The other dimension has to do with, I guess, is simply political power. Well, let's talk about paternalism, then we'll talk about the political power secondly. So my second dimension is paternalism, which is related to regulation. The question is as to what extent should the markets be allowed to operate freely, even if it hurts people who don't understand, versus trying to have the government out there to protect people from themselves. And so this is another area where there's a difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, with the Democrats generally being a little bit more sympathetic to the paternalism, with the Republicans being aware of the problem, but thinking it's best solved by allowing people to lose and learn their lesson from it. Into this, there's another issue that cannot be ignored. There is big money behind a lot of things that happen in our markets: payment for order flow, market data, fees, dealer profits, the ability to do transactions like SPACs and stuff like that. And that money tends to lobby intensely if they feel that their franchise, their opportunity, whatever you want to call it, is being challenged. They will lobby by donating to senators on both sides of the aisle, but sometimes more to, depending on the issue, more to Republicans than to Democrats. The commissioners, whether they're on the Republican side or the Democratic side, not counting the chairman, the commissioners are usually young, aspiring politicians. And so they're thinking about what their political future is. And as a consequence, they're quite responsive to powerful senators who probably don't care at all about the issues that they're writing letters about, but they write the letters on behalf of their constituents who are funding their campaigns. And their principle is pretty simple, that they raise money where it's cheapest, cheap being in terms of their cost to their principles, if you will, and their cares, and they spend it where it's most dear, whether that's on abortion or social issues or, from one side or the other. And so you get this strange situation where a lot of the decisions that the commissioners are making are being driven by senators who are being driven by their constituents. It's not a happy thing that I'm telling you. But it is a reality. Now the question is, how do you beat that down? So the way you beat it down is, as Craig said, you always have to have a reputation for being impartial. You have to speak to the mission of the agency and say, listen, we're here to promote fairness, competitive markets, and so forth. And the proposed regulation that we're discussing, here's how it impacts upon that mission. And then you also have to try to make a personal contact with the commissioner in an attempt to get them in a position of cognitive dissonance, that basically get them to admit that, you're actually right, Harris, but I have to deal with these other interests. They won't say that out loud, but actually they have on occasion. And sort of put them in a position where it's a personal integrity issue. This is the right thing. There are people who are pushing on this. Let's figure out how you can make a strong statement of what's right without burning the people who you're going to depend upon in the future. And in general, one of the most important things that an economist can do as an advisor, aside from producing the good research, is to provide talking points that provide perspectives that the commissioners might not otherwise have seen. So to justify a policy with a talking point that could be economically motivated, but I'll give you an example. Try to get the trace data made public. The talking point is, how much better would you have been, would people be if they knew the price of used cars, just as the salesman does, right? So if used car prices were reported, then consumers would have a stronger place to stand. And so if you can divvy those out to the commissioners who want to speak and become popular, that's helpful as well.
So I'm going to pivot a little bit here, and I'm going to pivot on a question that was asked. As a doctoral student, how much aligning research questions with policy implications will help publication? A little bit of that was discussed in the editors panel this morning, and I want to use that to pivot to GameStop. Not talk about GameStop necessarily specifically, but all of the other economic issues that it exposed, potential market failures or things that got the public's attention. So Chester, why don't we start with, or actually Larry, should we start with you, Larry, or who is going to start?
Well, I can. Well,
go ahead, Chester.
Let me try to. I'll try to just weigh in on the publication. Let me try to weigh in on the question from the student about the publication issue. So I think without drilling down on the details of the GameStop situation, which I think are probably pretty widely known. In a sense, it provides I think an interesting opportunity to get some traction in the publication process, because it leads to an identifiable set of issues of potentially broader interest than would otherwise be the case. You also have a situation where at least there's some data that not necessarily all the types of data that one would like to have, but there's a bunch of data, including the TAC data, et cetera, that's publicly available and obviously broken out by security. So it provides kind of a focus. And there are some interesting methodological papers that are out there that are kind of getting at issues involving what's retail and what's not retail and some of those kind of questions. And so in a sense, it provides, I think, kind of an interesting catalyst. And also, if to the extent that one of the goals of both young authors and also journal editors, as the panel this morning highlighted, is to create citations. Well, this is kind of an interesting area if you can be one of the early participants. This is an area where it's possible to get a lot of attention. Now, what types of studies, what types of studies will work? I think what types of studies will be effective? Well, obviously studies which are more methodologically sophisticated, which pay good attention to method, that's obviously also very, 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 very important. But it's also important to have a good question, to have a question that other people are interested in. And I think that's GameStop and the variety of the issues that spill out of it potentially provides a lot of opportunities along those lines.
So some of the things, go ahead, Larry.
Editors publish papers that they think are important, and they consult their referees to understand what's important. So there are a couple ways a paper can be important. But probably the most important is that the reader of the paper can recognize that what they're learning changes how they understand the world and how that changes practice. Sometimes papers are important because they provide new methods that can be used by others. But that's it's more common in an econometric or something like that. But in general, in finance, the editors are very practice oriented. They want to know how does this extend our knowledge in a way that will produce a better world. So a better world often comes down to public policy. And so doing work on public policy is probably the best way to identify topics that editors will like. There's one, I would caution you though, there is one type of paper that editors tend not to be particularly sympathetic to that are very important in public policy. So say you have a paper that basically is just one more application of demand theory, that you raise the price of something and people do less of it, okay? Editors aren't going to be particularly interested in that, even if the paper addresses a topic that is extraordinarily important in public policy. So an example of this would be if pharmaceutical companies pay doctors to prescribe, will doctors prescribe more? It's just a pure example of, supply and demand theory. I mean, just demand theory, basically, right? Okay, but that's an extraordinarily important public policy issue. Some editors are sympathetic to it because of its importance. Here's a demonstration paper that says rigorously, this practice is causing trouble. And so it's very important. Other editors will look at it and say, there's no new knowledge here. This should be done in a think tank, not in an academic journal. So personally, I side more with the idea that even though there's no new knowledge, the documentation of an important issue that's important to public policy is worthy of publication. So with that caveat, you sort of have to have some understanding of where the editors will be on that. Some will take one side and some will take the other.
Yeah, another anonymous question came in that probably we all can identify with. It says sometimes you see one paper accepted where the marginal or rejected where the marginal contribution was less than another paper that was accepted. And how do we evaluate which marginal contribution is important, which is publishable? And I think that you just spoke to that, Larry, which is it's all in the eyes of the beholder, and the public policy lens may come up with a much different conclusion than an editor at a journal.
Yeah, and I would make one additional point. If let's say some group of journals is publishing 200 papers over the course of the year, and the question is, you had 198th best contribution, but the 200 but you were rejected. But the one with the 203rd best contribution was published, which is in a sense the framing of the question. You have something which is marginal, but only slightly marginal. One's goal shouldn't be to have something marginal. If the best case you can make for your paper is that it's kind of slightly better than the weakest paper in the journal, that's not likely to produce to success.
Even when the objectives, am I cutting you off, Craig?
No, go ahead, Larry. I'll come in afterward.
Even when the objectives of the profession and the editors are well understood, people will make mistakes, and there'll be colored judgment with one person favoring one the other. It's important to note that if you listen to authors, they think that this process is seriously flawed because what they remember is the rejections and not the acceptances. But my experience with editors and referees is that by and large, they do get it right. And if you just stick with it long enough and stay focused on what's important and do good work, you'll eventually get rewarded.
Craig, did you want to add something?
So I'll just take it down a slightly different track, and that is if you're thinking about doing policy-oriented research, or at least some of the research questions you're trying to answer are informed by current policy issues. One way to, I think, try and better understand where the gaps are is to actually pay attention to what the regulators are asking and how they're framing the issues. So there is a lot to be learned by going through and looking at rule proposals, right? And the regulator is going to effectively lay out the way they look at the issue, what they need help with. And so a lot of times there are actually valuable research ideas buried in rule proposals because the regulator is effectively saying, we don't have an authoritative source that will help us answer this question, and we would like somebody to come in and fill the gap. Now, most of the time, it's going to come back to one of the points that Larry was making, and that's going to be people from industry that have a vested interest who are going to be aggressively trying to fill the gap. But as a former regulator, I can tell you that I paid a lot more attention to work by academics who were trying to basically answer that question.
And pay special attention to concept releases. A concept
Exactly.
release is a release before a rule proposal where the government says, we really don't know what's going on here, but we know it's important. And so that allows you plenty of time to get your work done and have an influence.
You know, it also, Craig, you also bring up a really important point for generating ideas. If you're a PhD student, go to sec.gov, go to final rules that were passed in 2012, 13, or 14, or 15. Look at the questions asked back then, and now you've got data to potentially go answer whether or not they got it right. So that'd be a shortcut way. Pick your field of area that you like: investment management, asset management, broker dealers, corporate finance, and look at the rules and see if there's an idea there for you to answer.
You will be helping the SEC engage in retrospective review, which is something that has been on the table for years, but never really seems to push forward. And for those of you that aren't familiar with retrospective review, what it means is that why should the SEC should be required to go back and ask, did the rule work? Did the rule work as intended? Is it necessary? Does it need to be modified?
Good point. All right, so let's go back to GameStop for a second. And can you each maybe pull one potential implication from GameStop that, as a young researcher, you could use an episode like this to think of a research question? There's lots of things that came out of GameStop that we maybe revisit how we think about markets. Can we each just kind of go around and just decompose how you look at GameStop and something that came out of it that may be worthy of research?
The single biggest issue associated with GameStop in terms of the importance to the economy is that it has chilled short selling. Short selling is a very important process in our economy for the formation of prices that reflect investment potentials. And short sellers got kicked in the teeth terribly. And they are unaware that they're afraid of getting back into it. And so they've withdrawn. Simply documenting the extent to which they've withdrawn would be important. That's probably pretty easy and can be done already. Documenting the effect on valuations of the withdrawal of short sellers is important. And all of this is important because it's connected to the capital allocation process. One of the most disturbing, but fortunately not a huge part of the this meme story, is that companies like GameStop and AMC were able to raise capital at ridiculously high prices in comparison to what most reasonable people think are their valuations. And so they obtained control over capital that they otherwise wouldn't have had, probably because they frankly don't have great business models. I mean, AMC is in the business of showing movies. Never mind the damage to their business by COVID. Their business has been damaged by streaming and 4K TV sets in everybody's front room, and the fact that you can make popcorn a lot cheaper by just buying an air popper. There's still a role for going out on a date, go to a theater or something like that, but it's been diminished by these other technological problems. And of course, GameStop has similar problems. Well, that money that they now control has benefited their shareholders. Well, that's fine with that. But the real problem is it's taken money away that otherwise should have been allocated to development of new vaccines, the development of new materials, of just new knowledge, new processes that would be of greater benefit to us than the preservation of these two old business models. So short selling is unpopular. It's clearly un-American. Nobody likes somebody else stepping on, raining on your parade. But it's really important for ensuring that there's good capital allocation. It's also very important, and this is abstract, but still an important process. It's important that prices reflect values so that we don't have uninformed investors buying at high prices, as they did in GameStop, and losing, and then basically withdrawing from the markets because they don't think they're fair, or they're just not smart enough or something like that. You get a lot of those people withdrawing, then they won't save for their retirements and will end up paying for them. And to the extent that they lose money, they won't have the money to retire and will end up paying for them too. So there are external issues that are very important here that are worthy of research.
So I certainly agree with Larry that the issues of value of shorting and valuation are very important. They clearly emerge front and center as a byproduct of GameStop. I often have talked about short selling is very important because they protect America's investors against buying overpriced assets. That seems to me fundamental. I think another issue, which clearly the trading episode has shined a spotlight on, are the role of zero commissions and low commissions in the trading process, and some of the issues associated with alternative ways in which trading is being paid for. And it's clear that the payment for order flow issue is emerging sort of somewhat more front and center on the regulatory debate. I think I also sort of see that as connected to other kinds of issues associated with different types of payments, the so-called make-take process, rebates and fees process in the trading, and that certainly was related to kind of some recent unsuccessful efforts of the SEC to do a pilot in that space, and the fact that rebates are tiered, which raises all kinds of issues as well about just the nature of routing and conflicts of interest, and the like. And I do think these are potentially interesting issues. They point to alternative ways to price services. They point to possible conflicts, but the conflicts can arise in a variety of different ways. And I think there's both interesting theoretical and empirical issues for young researchers to study in this space that I think GameStop has shined a big spotlight on as well.
So when I think about sort of the GameStop and payment for order flow, it seems to be one that should be squarely in the SEC's wheelhouse to try and deal with, because to me, payment for order flow is one of transparency. As long as there's transparency about how orders are being routed on behalf of investors, that seems like that should be enough. One of the questions I have would be, how much does it cost to trade? What benefits has a firm like Robinhood brought? And it certainly has made retail investors, it's made it much more attractive for a retail investor to participate in the market. People decry the disappearance of retail investors, while certainly providing zero cost brokerage services has provided investors with a way to come back into markets and fully participate. So when you think about payment for order flow, what is the actual cost to a retail investor? Because these are small traders. Are we talking about dollars on a trade? Are we talking about pennies? Are we talking about fractions of a penny? How much is it really costing me? Is it a penny? I'm probably not going to even stop to pick a penny up off the sidewalk if I pass it on the street. Why do I care about whether it costs whether Robinhood made a penny on my trade, and in exchange for that penny, I didn't have to pay anything for the trade at all. We should, I mean, I think there needs to be a more complete examination of what really are the costs and benefits around payment for order flow. And I feel like it's been vilified in the financial press to a certain extent. And it's not clear to me that that vilification is warranted by what is actually the net impact on.
One of the things that we've learned from behavioral finance is that while economists think a dollar is a dollar, it's not true. Some dollars are different than other dollars according to how people perceive them. And their perceptions affect their behavior. So zero commissions, commission dollars are things that you pay and lose right now. They have a different value to people than money that they don't see. And we see this in a number of different places. It's an important thing for us to recognize. So in general, or my observation is that there are a lot of hidden pipelines that move money around in the markets. And those pipelines exist because they create or exploit agency problems, or because they are designed to create competitive power, like the discrimination among the rebate rates. So you have volume discounts, stuff like that. Only possible if you have these pipelines running, or because they allow different perceptions of the value of a dollar. It's really worthwhile to consider all of these pipelines and whether they're really in the public interest. There are somewhere you might argue that they are. So, for example, one pipeline is, and some of them are well known. One pipeline is are the loads that people pay on loaded funds. So, what does that pipeline do? It funds the people who sell the loaded funds, but those people who are selling loaded funds are providing financial services. In particular, they're providing financial planning services, not uniformly, but they often do. And it's often the case that people won't spend real money, what they perceive to be real money for those services, but they'll allow it to be carved out of their investments in a way that they don't recognize. I find that highly inefficient and greatly troubling, but I could see that somebody who understands that might take a paternal attitude about it and say, well, it's good for the client. What I find really interesting, though, is that maybe a Republican who wouldn't be paternal normally would take this point of view because they think, well, why should we regulate at all? So, I mean, they could support the loads or the potential existence of loads just on the principle, let the market determine for itself. But in effect, what they're doing, is a form of paternalism that I find a little strange. So
yeah, that's a good point, Larry. And I always think about when I'm teaching classes and I ask a student, what's better, a 5% load or a 1% asset management fee? It's against perception. We've seen loads go away because they seem like big numbers, but all of a sudden 200 basis point asset management seems more attractive because they don't understand the time value of money.
Well, the trouble with my argument, though, is that a lot of times the load is collected and the financial planning services aren't provided. So that's really inefficient.
There's many dimensions. I wanted to shift gears again, because there's a topic that I wanted, hopefully, Chester to address on proxy advisory firms. And I'll just preface it by saying that in a very interesting panel to close yesterday, John Concord said there's a big agency problem with respect to ESG because money managers like Vanguard are voting in ways that are different than what he would want, but he feels locked in, he can't switch. And so I'm going to use that as a catalyst, hopefully, for Chester to tell us about, proxy advisory firms. Has been a big policy debate over the past year there, and it's still going on.
Thanks, Scott. So if if we step back and think about the underlying economics, there's a relatively big at a few different levels. There's a relatively big free rider problem among the owners of companies in terms of how much they invest in being informed to make better voting decisions. And as a result of that, proxy advisory firms such as ISS and Glass Lewis have come along to at least partially resolve that free rider problem by providing a variety of informational services and in some cases even providing vote recommendations. Well, the import of that in turn has been to make those firms very, very powerful and basically drive to some extent the outcomes. Corporate leadership is often very fearful about being on the wrong side of the proxy advisory firm with respect to their policies and potentially that leading to ousting of their directors and the like. So one of the points that I highlighted in a recent paper of mine in the review of corporate finance studies was if one looks at the data, it looks like that the BlackRocks and the Vanguards of the world look to be a lot more pro-management than, let's say, ISS, the leading proxy advisory firm. And so I would suggest that this perhaps means that maybe we should view the index funds as providing the right benchmark rather than the proxy advisory firm. At least I think it raises important questions about that. And in some current work with Andre and Nadia Malenko, we're actually pursuing what is the objective of a proxy advisory firm, and our theoretical analysis concluded that the proxy advisory firm's interest might be enhanced by promoting controversy, because that makes basically the information that it's producing potentially more valuable. But these issues, they're really at the core of corporate governance. Now, and the problem from the SEC's perspective, it has historically wanted to really rely upon the corporate governance by the shareholders, but there are these frictions, the free rider problem on the one hand, but then you have these advisory firms, they partially resolve the free rider problem, but with their having a lot of power. And then the question is, so do the index funds, do they provide a solution? Well, I think both the panel yesterday and I think also the votes by the leading institutional investors in the Exxon situation, I think kind of highlight, well, these large institutional investors, they're very, very powerful, and ultimately their agenda potentially drives the outcomes. It's not as if the voting situation is like an election in the economy, in the larger economy, where you've got a lot of atoms who are independently voting and you get some aggregation. Potentially here, a very small number of participants ultimately determine the outcome. And I think this raises, a lot of fundamental questions about the nature of governance that I think are still ripe to study. And I think on the one hand, there's the theoretical issues, as I've partially framed them just now, but I think there's also a host of empirical issues, and in part, very nice empirical issues, because there's such great data. There's great data on the recommendations of ISS, and I believe on Glass Lewis as well. And there's great data per the Commission's regulation NPX about the votes of the mutual funds, at least going back to 2003 or so. So there's opportunities, I think, here for theoretical and empirical study about some of the most fundamental issues in governance. Now, the SEC during the prior administration pulled back on the power of the proxy advisory firm somewhat. In the end, I think relatively modestly. But the current leadership has indicated it's not going to basically enforce those changes and going to potentially restudy those changes. So you have that backdrop, and then you have the additional backdrop that I think these issues of voting are going to become more important as the Exxon Engine 1 situation illustrates. As there's a greater emphasis on ESG and climate change. And so I think these issues may well move front and center. And I think there's potentially interesting opportunities I want to stress both theoretically and empirically to get at possibly some of the fundamentals of corporate governance.
Yeah, you bring up some interesting points, and proxy advisory firms have probably been less studied than other parts of the markets like credit rating agencies, but matter as much, if not more, in many respects. And so I think you point to some good data from NPX and others for aspiring researchers to start thinking about doing empirical work, if not theoretical work in this area.
A couple of years ago with a collaborator, I wrote a monograph on credit rating agencies, and we pointed to some of the analogies with the proxy advisory firms. But what we had to say about the proxy advisory firms was, I think, pretty modest. And I think even now, there's not such a big literature on something which is, I think, really fundamental in the process. And when I say fundamental, I don't mean necessarily completely negatively, because there is a role. The free rider problem in the broader governance issue is really important. The commonalities and information that are being produced. This is sort of at the heart of why I think there's an important role for the proxy advisory firms. But then how to think about their role and the the governance and what should be the regulatory restrictions. I think these are important issues, but I think they've also gotten mixed up a little bit with broader issues in the political debate. So, for example, the Chamber of Commerce has very strong views, and labor unions have very strong views, and I think this has sort of led to some of the mess in the regulatory process, and why there's been so much pushback.
The potential for regulatory intervention in this market is limited substantially by the First Amendment. These entities, the rating firms, whether they're rating financials or regulating voting issues, are simply expressing opinions that are protected by First Amendment. There is still a very important place where the SEC plays a role. They can regulate the processes to make sure that they're not capricious. But perhaps more importantly, in investment management, they regulate the meaning of terms. So for instance, if in your prospectus you say that you are pursuing an ESG strategy or something like that, then it's important for the investor to know what that means. If you are, taking some progressive position or a more conservative position or something like that with respect to governance, and you want to apply those labels to a product that you're selling, now the SEC has the right to intervene, because language has to have a uniform meaning to everybody. It can't be misleading. And so this is the area where the SEC, frankly, has its greatest. It may have greater interest elsewhere in this area, but its greatest influence. It's the only vehicle that it really has to act, and it's a very important one.
So we have 2 minutes left, and Kumar Venkataraman asked a question of the panel that I think is a great way to end it. And he asks, what are your thoughts on working as an SEC economist after earning a PhD, maybe even as a visiting scholar, benefits and costs? Can we use that as your final remarks to talk about spending some time at the SEC as an economist? Greg,
maybe I'll go first on this one. I think it's a great idea. I think that I know personally, I was surprised by how little I really understood about the way markets function, despite thinking I was an expert, right? And so I believe that there's a lot of human capital to be developed while you're at the commission. You will have an opportunity to have direct access, not only to regulators, but to the firms whose policies are being implicated by the regulation. So a lot of different perspectives, you learn a ton. I think it's a great idea, especially maybe more for the seasoned professor than for a newly minted PhD.
I would agree. I would agree with Craig on all counts that it's a great opportunity, but also more for the seasoned person who I think can benefit more perhaps from the experience, and also can figure out how to leverage, is a better position to figure out how to leverage the opportunity of being there, as opposed to being maybe demoralized by the high work demands of the staff, of being a staff member, and not being able to focus much on the publication process. But one of the point that I would also emphasize, at least what I thought was particularly valuable about being at the commission, and Craig also referred to this, was the opportunity to learn and enhance one's perspective. It was much less, I felt, about what I think outsiders think. Oh, this is the greatest place to get data. I didn't particularly think that was necessarily the case, and that a lot of times, in fact, there were all kinds of, even though there was opportunities to get, and sometimes there were good opportunities to get data, by the way, and it's not that there weren't, but I thought that was maybe relatively secondary. And sometimes when there were good opportunities to get data, then there were all kinds of impediments to being able to use it anyway.
Exactly.
And so it seemed to me it was more an opportunity in terms of broadening perspective. You know, and there might be some data opportunities, but one shouldn't go there simply one just figures this is going to be the way I'm going to get all kinds of data that I can't get. I think that's probably too narrow an approach.
A newly minted PhD should be thinking about three things when deciding where to go. They should be thinking about what research opportunities they may have. And of course, the SEC is a very rich place. They should be thinking about what learning opportunities they have. And the SEC is also very good for that, because you learn what's important and you're exposed to practitioners and regulators who have a really clear understanding of how the markets work and, again, what's important. But they also should be interested in looking for mentoring opportunities. It's very important that junior people in the profession have people they can talk to who can give them good advice. And you sometimes can find that at the SEC. Usually there's a few people at the SEC who are close to or at the top of the profession, and that's great. For some candidates who don't have the ability to get into a first-rate university department, then the SEC becomes very attractive, because the mentorship opportunities might be better at the SEC than elsewhere. On the other hand, for those who are getting into really good departments, what you lose by going to the SEC is the potential for being well mentored by people who care a lot about you. So all that said, the decision depends on sort of who you are and what your opportunities are. I concur that there's absolutely no question that once you become seasoned, going to the SEC or the CFTC or similar agencies is extraordinarily beneficial to your career. Gives you great research opportunities and great learning opportunities.
And I'll maybe add one more thing Larry alluded to, and that is you will develop a network of people that you can contact after you leave the commission that will never be available to you as an academic. You can call people who are directly involved in policy debates. These same people will now be housed in law offices, prestigious law offices. So your network will be enhanced in a fundamentally different way by your experience at the commission.
So one other point that I should also just note, though, the opportunity may not be available to everybody. The SEC has particular rules as to whom it might consider hiring. If you're a U.S. citizen, you're in an ideal category, and I think there are people who are citizens of some other countries that have close ties to the U.S. that may have opportunities as well. But the citizenship issue is a first order, potentially a first order entry barrier.
And
So I
it
think
changes years to year
And it has
with
changed
appropriations law.
over
Yeah.
time. So that's why I'm not being very specific, because it has changed
Yeah.
over time. But I think it's an important issue to be candid about as well.
So we've gone over by 5 minutes, but it was a mentoring conversation that spilled over in career advice, and I'm sure PhD students appreciate getting that. But I want to thank our panelists for a terrific discussion. Thank all of the attendees for staying on for the full 2 days. Hope you got something out of it. That was the purpose, was to help you with your research programs, and if it did a little bit, then great. But thanks again for everybody. And next year we hope to do this live in person in Austin. See you.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Scott. See you.